It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. In 2007, a little movie premiered at Screamfest Horror Film Festival. An agent who happened to be at the festival and watched the movie was so impressed that they immediately wanted to represent the film's director, Oren Peli. Now, after getting DVDs of the movie sent out to as many people as possible, it eventually found its way to Jason Blum, a senior executive with Miramax Films. Now, Blum worked to re-edit the film with Peli and hoped to get it distribution. Now, eventually, DreamWorks made a deal in the hopes of making a bigger budget remake of this movie. And that eventually fell through, however, and Blum and Peli screened the film to a test audience with their new edit. And that audience began walking out. And DreamWorks thought that, this might have been a huge mistake, until it was learned that people walking out was due to being so frightened that these people couldn't remain in their seats. Paramount, the owner of DreamWorks, bought the sequel rights and distribution of this newer edit of the movie Blum and Peli made. And that film would go on to make nearly $200 million on only a total cost over a few years of somewhere between $215,000 and $230,000. Now, that movie spawned 7 sequels, the next one due this year. But it all began with Oren Peli's non-gory, somewhat based in reality spookfest, Paranormal Activity. Now, without a single doubt in my mind, Paranormal Activity is the movie that put Blumhouse Productions on the map. Jason Blum was an executive for some time. He had that job at Miramax where it eventually led to him seeing this tiny micro-budgeted film, Paranormal Activity. And he produced Kicking and Screaming in 1995, which was directed by Noah Baumbach, who has thrice been nominated for an Academy Award. And Blum also worked as a producing director at Ethan Hawke's theater company, Malapart. But at the dawn of the 2000s, Blum's interest in producing small-budget films and allowing for directors to have full creative control led to him forming Blumhouse Productions. And while it's best known for making horror films, Blumhouse also makes all sorts of different types of movies. In fact, the first few films weren't horror films. Then along came Paranormal Activity. After that, Blumhouse exploded, and it's hard to find a year go by for the company that it doesn't have a major success. The allocation of funds and efforts by Blumhouse is what made the company work. Jason Blum makes a couple of different types of movies. Small, micro-budgeted films that usually will have some sort of built-in distribution to streaming services like Hulu or other platforms, and then major films that would normally get produced in conjunction with Universal Pictures. The latter is where you get your Halloween movies or the Jordan Peele movies and so forth. However, both types of films help constantly have money flowing into Blumhouse, and the company is at a point now where, honestly, it would take an incredible string of stunning flops to sink this company. As for Israeli-born Oren Peli, he directed exactly 2 films, Paranormal Activity and 2015's Area 51. He's mostly been a producer working on, what else? Blumhouse production movies. He's been the producer of the sequels to Paranormal Activity, but also the Insidious movies. That is yet another successful franchise that Blumhouse can lay claim to. There are only like 4 or 5 people in Paranormal Activity. Much the same as with the Blair Witch Project the decade before, this movie relies on unknowns to really help this movie feel that much more real. But unlike the Blair Witch Project, it was never promoted to be a real occurrence to build up hype for this movie, that you're seeing something almost taboo. The most recognizable character in this, Katie, is played by actress Katie Featherston. Now, she had a few roles before this movie was released, and while she hasn't done much outside the franchise itself, she can probably make a pretty good living by just going to horror conventions and showing up for whatever new Paranormal Activity movie gets made. Now, I know that I said that this movie wasn't marketed in a way like Blair Witch Project to make it feel real, but the movie does open with Paramount Pictures expressing their gratitude to the families of the couple and the San Diego Police Department. However, the movie was marketed more virally. Paramount only selected about a dozen cities that it would play at and asked others at the end of the trailer to demand it play in more markets. The trailer mostly shows snippets of the movie and the audience reactions, and that's been a pretty classic technique to build excitement around horror films in particular lately. So we learn that this couple, Mika and Katie, are living in San Diego, and Mika has bought this crazy fancy camera, and it's a bit more than what Katie was really expecting. But why did he buy this camera that basically captures the rest of this movie? Well, Katie believes something is in the house. She's bothered by noises and the feeling that there's another presence. It's kind of clear that Mika is really into this camera, but he also wants to ease her mind that everything is fine. Don't worry about it. You're just, it's just normal house sounds. These opening minutes are just quick little cuts of seeing this young couple in their typical daily routine. They eat dinner, they hang out, he plays guitar, she does crocheting or other kind of hobbies that she has with crafting, and then they go to bed. The camera remains on while they sleep, but eventually we move to about 2 hours later where the camera's onboard microphone captures some soft pounding noises. The next morning, Katie finds her keys in the middle of the floor after she placed them on the kitchen counter the night before. Katie has contacted a psychic and asked him to come over to investigate the house, but Mika doesn't really take it very seriously. He jokingly asks if the psychic could give him stock tips or, kind of tasteless jokes about what someone who claims clairvoyance would know in advance and so on. As the psychic starts asking questions, we learn that this is not the first time Katie's felt bizarre presences in a home. When she was a little girl, Katie was visited by a dark mass that she says her sister could see too, but it never stood at the foot of her sister's bed, only her own. That house burned down under suspicious circumstances. These experiences have kind of followed Katie throughout her life in multiple homes, but it's kind of come and gone. It just only recently returned. And Katie claims that she hears something whispering her name. Now, Mika does agree that he's heard some weird noises, but he also thinks many of these claims are explained away by saying it's just something in the house, it's something outside, he's talking in his sleep, and so forth. Although, if something is going on, Mika sure would like to capture it on camera. Ultimately, the psychic tells Katie that he specializes in ghosts, but he thinks that what she's experiencing is a demon that has kind of attached itself to her and followed her since she was a little girl. He gives her the name of another colleague who works in demonology, and Mika would like to try to communicate with the so-called demon through a Ouija board. The psychic really doesn't think this is a good idea. And he doesn't want Mika doesn't want Katie to call the demonologist and just let this thing go. He's kind of over this whole charade of talking to psychics and all of these other kind of gobbledygook. Now, on the third night, again, around 2 a.m., we see the couple asleep, but we hear some footsteps and creaking, and the bedroom door begins to move a little bit. On the fifth night, just before 3 a.m., Katie suddenly wakes up from a nightmare, but that's not all. Downstairs, a loud bang occurs. Mika goes downstairs to look at what happened, and Katie follows with the camera, but they don't really find anything. The next day, while Katie and a friend of hers is doing some crafts, Mika plays for them part of the recording that sounds like something trying to communicate. He decides that he is going to go get a Ouija board to talk to this thing, but both girls say he absolutely should not. He claims to understand that, he gets it. He understands what they're saying. However, several nights later, on night 13 before bed, he tells the thing in the house that it's been a little while since anything's happened, so he begins taunting it. And that night around 3:15 a.m., Katie wakes up hearing noises again. Then it growls and follows that with a massive bang on the wall that makes even a hanging light downstairs, or from the ceiling rather, that goes downstairs from the loft, swing. The noises continue for a little while, even after Katie and Micah go back to bed. Now, becoming even more fascinated by what he is also experiencing, Micah decides to try to capture electronic voice phenomenon of the demon. He really doesn't get any answers to his questions except for when he mentions using a Ouija board. The next night, Katie gets out of bed and stands still next to the bed for 2 hours before ultimately leaving the room. Micah finds her outside on the porch swing in the backyard. She doesn't want to go back inside, and she seems a little out of it. When Micah goes back inside, he sees that the bedroom TV was turned on, but no one else is around. When Katie comes back in, she has no recollection of being outside. The next day, Micah says he wants to call an exorcist or something to say that, he wants to help get rid of this thing before it gets worse, because he tells Katie that he only thinks it will get worse. But later on, Micah, acting more like what we've seen from him earlier in the movie, has revealed to us through the camera that he's borrowed a Ouija board and wants to use it before they go out on a date. Incensed, Katie leaves and he follows, but Micah's left the camera on and pointing at the board, and there's a big breeze that comes in and starts kind of blowing the curtains and the plants around, and the planchette begins to move on its own before the board lights on fire. Later, inspecting the board, Micah believes that a message was burned into it for them. Katie does not even want to think about what was possibly left behind and just wants the thing out of the house. Now, while Micah still tries to figure out what the message on the board is, he decides to try something else. He spreads baby powder on the floor upstairs to see what comes in and out of the bedroom. Katie says that after that, she's calling the demonologist. Micah says it's his house and it's his girlfriend and he's going to take care of the problem. And she has doubts. On night number 17, about 3:15 a.m., we hear footsteps and it wakes the couple up. They find footprints on the floor in powder. The footsteps come into the bedroom, but they do not go out. And they don't really look like human prints, and something maybe a little more hooven, or I don't know, like almost like a paw maybe instead of feet. It almost looks like it only has 3 digits as opposed to normal, 5 toes or whatever. When the couple look in the closet where the footprints appear to have started, they find the tile to the access of the attic open. And Micah looks in and finds only one thing stuck in the insulation, surprisingly, over their bed, or what would be their bed. And that is a picture of Katie as a little girl standing in front of the house that burnt down, and the picture has scorched corners. The demonologist appears to be on vacation, but that night, just before 4 a.m., a light from downstairs turns on, and Micah wakes up hearing something coming up the stairs towards their room. And when he gets up to see what's going on, heavy footsteps run out of the room and the bedroom door slams shut. They go out to investigate, but more bangs and footsteps, and the bedroom door slams shut again once they leave the room. Katie refuses to go back into the bedroom, but as they go downstairs, noises start to occur down there too, forcing them back to their bedroom. The next day, the sounds are happening even earlier than usual. They find the picture frame of the two of them has cracked over Micah's face, and the picture itself has scratches on his face. Katie then says that she feels something breathing on her. Things are getting far worse for the couple. Now, the next day, the psychic returns, but he says he can't really help. He's forced out of the house, as a matter of fact, due to the heavy presence that he's feeling. In a couple of days, the demonologist will be back, but there's really nothing they can do. They can't really leave the house, and the psychic can't help them. Because if it's attached to Katie, it's not the house that's haunted, it's Katie. So leaving won't do them anything. On the 19th night, something blows up the sheet that Katie is sleeping under, and later that same night, the closet light turns on and a shadow moves across the bedroom door, and Katie wakes up again saying that she can feel the breathing on her. She's particularly agitated and saying that something is wrong. The next day that she says that she can feel it watching her and she can't seem to calm down. Mika also finds out that someone from the 60s had the same thing happen and even had a similar life experiences at the same ages as Katie did. House burning down, experiencing this at age 8, 13, and then again as an adult. That night, the shadow returns, and this time it pulls Katie out of the bed and pulls her down the hallway and slams the door shut on Mika. He is able to retrieve her, but the whole thing is escalating quickly. Mika takes footage of what appears to be a pretty nasty bite on Katie's back. And she begs him to basically leave, and he says that he'll get a hotel, but by the time he packs the car, he finds Katie in a daze and grasping a crucifix so hard that she's actually bleeding. Shortly thereafter, surprisingly, she no longer wants to leave. In fact, she's downright positive things are going to be all right. And that brings us to night number 21, when things finally come to a head. Katie sits up in bed and, in a much more deliberate way, walks to Mika's side of the bed and stares at him for almost 2 hours before she simply walks out of the room. Shortly after, she screams for Mika, and he runs downstairs to her. He begins screaming in pain, and soon we hear footsteps coming back up the stairs, and Mika's body is thrown into the bedroom and at the camera, knocking it over. Shortly after, we see Katie, with blood all over her shirt, walking into the bedroom, and she begins to crawl towards the camera. She smiles at the camera and lunges at it, her face distorting into a more demonic visage. It's said that later, Mika's body was discovered by police and that Katie's gone missing. Now, I should mention that there are a couple of alternate endings to this movie. The one that I described is the one where Katie is having been revealed as essentially killing Mika, thrown his body at the camera, and then distorted into a monster. That's the theatrical ending. And I believe that it was referred to colloquially as the Spielberg ending. The idea being presented to them by DreamWorks or by Paramount, one or the other. The original ending that was only seen, I believe, at Screamfest had Katie come back into the bedroom, blood covering her shirt and holding a giant knife. She sits on the floor rocking back and forth. Now, she is discovered by her friend that we saw earlier in the movie, and then the police comes and she snaps out of her trance and asks about Mika. When the demon makes a noise startling the cops, one of them shoots her dead. And that ending was scrapped. It was only screened publicly once. The other ending that was not released theatrically but was shot as part of some of the post-production stuff to get this movie distribution had Katie come back to the bedroom, locking the door, and she goes up to the camera and slits her own throat and collapses dead. I've seen that ending as well. That was on the DVD that was released back in 2010 or 2009, whenever the DVD came out. The theatrical ending is definitely what led to a franchise that deals with Katie being marked at an early age and something to do with her and her sister's parents being witches or something, and her needing to get her sister's baby in the sequel and so on. But let's get to the three things I like about Paranormal Activity. The first thing I'd like to point out is that I do like how quote-unquote believable this movie is. Oren Peli set out to make this unlike most horror movies that came out around the same time. Sure, there were movies coming out about ghosts and spooks and what have you, but many horror movies tend to go for gore. He wanted this to be something that creates scares and shocks in different ways. And I feel like he achieved it really, really well. In fact, he does it in kind of three ways that will basically encompass all three of my likes that I'd like to call out for this movie. This first one is done with the characters themselves. I think they really feel like real people. Katie is basically like any other woman that you might live next door to or work with or just know through a friend or something. She's not overly glamorous. She communicates kind of free and easy like she's someone you know. It doesn't really feel like either Katie Featherston or Mika Sloat are acting or clutching for what to say. Mika would end up becoming a little bit of a trope in haunting movies after this one was released and was so popular, as the kind of unserious or disbelieving boyfriend or husband who's maybe more interested in capturing the activity on camera, if there is such a thing, than actually maybe doing anything smart to try to stop it. But in a way, he's kind of set up to be a guy who would not really be taking this very seriously. He's described early on as a day trader, and he kind of carries himself like a dude bro, while Katie really does have these experiences that she talks about and recalls from her youth and so on. But this movie does a good job building these characters as actual people. And that leads to my second like. This movie is good at being boring in the first act. It's almost lulling you to sleep with how mundane these first few nights are in this first maybe 40 minutes or so. Oh, the door moves a couple of times, big whoop. But kind of like a roller coaster, this is only the slow climb up that first hill. Once we hit the peak, the movie flies down the hill and things progressively get worse and creepier by magnitudes. It also serves to fracture the two characters a little bit too. Mika becomes more dependent on making sure that he tries to communicate with this thing so he can personally tell it to get out, or that the camera is with him at all times trying to capture the strange and bizarre, while Katie is just plainly just cracking up. So the movie really handles the progression to ramp up the scares, and then it takes off and really begins to make you feel uncomfortable. Finally, what always makes me feel uncomfortable in a movie like this is when the camera is just stationary, like when they're asleep, and your eyes have to kind of scan and dart around the screen looking for something that you know will unsettle you. It's a great way to deal with the supernatural. Monsters jump out and grab you. Killers jump out and stab you. Ghosts are things that you feel, but you can't always see, or it's movement out of the corner of your eye. This is the type of spook that needs to force you to look sharp, and that only builds tension while you're waiting for the thing to ultimately scare you. And that's what I love about truly scary horror movies, being forced to look at the negative space for the terrible thing in the dark. That wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at FilmSeizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure Podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. And over the next 2 weeks, I'm going to return to Japan to get into the second films of two trilogies. The first stop, a return to the world of the yokai monsters as we find ourselves in the crossfire of spook warfare. Until next week, stay spooky.